Good morning. Today is Pentecost Sunday, the day on which we celebrate the coming of the Spirit, the Holy Spirit. This breath of God has come to bring everything pertaining to our well-being: comfort, hope, guidance, new vigor, empowering, companionship, and so much more. There is no adequate description for the Spirit, nor can she be contained to fit into our small and limited understanding. She is wind, breath, life, movement. She is unpredictable. Possibly the hope element brings us as much joy this morning as any of them. Maybe throughout this year, we have felt a little bit like the people referred to in this text. They kept on saying, "Our bones are dry. Our hope is gone, and we are doomed." Those are dramatic statements. When bones are dry, the living being that housed those bones has no life anymore. When hope is gone, that feels like the end of the road. And when we feel doomed, it is a desolation of the soul. We have felt all of that in this past year. Some who deal with depression and other mental health challenges feel it keenly and frequently. Not just when pandemics or other crushing life and death realities strike. I find it hopeful that our sacred texts can be this open and forthright. Yes, we have felt death, hopelessness, and desolation in this past year. We can say that without shame or guilt. It's all a part of life. There is an aspect of resurrection or rebirth related to the coming of the Spirit. A word that is somewhat commonly used actually means rebirth. It's the French word renaissance. The word renaissance, used historically, has to do with a new burst of art and music, development, growth, science, and progress. Some well-known people of the Renaissance era were, of course, philosopher and thinker Francis Bacon, astronomer Nicholas Copernicus, dramatist and playwright William Shakespeare, astronomer and mathematician Galileo, poet and philosopher Dante, and composers such as Monteverdi and Palestrina. The Renaissance followed the Middle Ages, an era which is often defined as a long period of cultural darkness and religious failure. The Roman Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire, specifically in this case. A time in which political and social and intellectual rebirth, which we now know as the Renaissance, was introduced. As with every historical period, there were positives and there were negatives that resulted from this time. Some of the positives included new art and music, expanded trade, architectural masterpieces, and inventions such as the printing press. Negatives, of course: classism remained in place. Women were still largely kept subject to their husbands and given no rights. Wars over religion. A thirst for expansion that led to an extensive slave trade out of West Africa. And of course, the colonization of Africa and North America. So much for a layperson's foray into the world of history. Present-day usage of the word Renaissance is mostly hopeful, thinking about coming out of a hard period and into a wide open space, the beginning of a new era, resurrection, and rebirth. What Chad read in our text from Ezekiel 37 does not initially describe a scene that would have us think about Renaissance or rebirth at all. Quite the opposite. Imagine having a vision that took you to a valley full of bones. Poppies in the spring, yes. Bones, not so much. The symbol of bones is associated with death. Even though this story is metaphorical, the picture it paints is rather macabre. Walking up and down through dead bones. No muscle, no flesh, no tendons, no breath, no blood flowing through any veins, just bones. Everything gone except for bones. That's not an inviting scene. We would not book our vacation or plan a hike there. And yet, This prophet of God was taken into this space in whatever manner and given a message. The prophet was told to speak to the bones. Now, before you shake your head and say, okay, that's more bizarre and troublesome than most of science fiction, remember, this is a metaphor, a picture that gives us insight into humanity. The people of that day kept on saying, our bones are dry, our hope is gone, and we are doomed. So presenting this picture of more bones than can be counted, disturbed by noise and wind and rattling, is dramatic, to put it mildly. It would remind us of the Middle Ages more than of the Renaissance. One thing I take from this metaphor is that anything we can imagine is still limited, very small. To grasp even a fraction of the vision described here, we would need new words, new concepts, and vision that sees through a wide-angle lens. We are in need of rebirth, renaissance. Just when we think something is dead, hopeless, disturbing to the point of off-putting, think again. Joseph Campbell, the professor of literature who saw all mythic narratives as variations of a single great story, says this: "It is the suffering itself that prepares us to receive the miracles." Suffering, preparing us to receive miracles. That may strike us as cliche, but if we think about rebirth or resurrection, something old has to die, or at least intentionally be given up in order for something new to emerge. According to this belief, the Middle Ages would have been the setup for the Renaissance, just as it was the Valley of the Dry Bones that was the setup for the revitalization of a people who had lost all hope. There's an unsettling parallel to where we are currently and what led to the earlier Renaissance era. It's a plague, a pandemic. Between 1338 and 1353, the Black Death, a bubonic plague pandemic, devastated Afro-Eurasia. This dreadful plague resulted in the deaths of between 75 and 200 million people in Eurasia and North Africa. The populations in these 14th century regions were not what they are today. So this is a devastating number of people who were wiped out. For people living at that time, there was no indication where this plague came from, or how to eradicate, or how to even survive it. People were absolute victims of a silent killer. If you compare that to the COVID-19 pandemic, many decades of research was quickly harnessed to equip, treat, and protect us. It may not seem that our response to this pandemic was nearly fast enough, but comparing it to the pandemic of the Middle Ages that spanned 15 years and wiped out half of the Afro-Eurasian population, we are living a different reality. In saying this, I do not minimize the regions of the globe that are currently reeling under the heavy weight of this pandemic. Even here, people continue to suffer, and the story is not yet over. It's no wonder that a new birth followed this period of cultural darkness, religious failure, the widespread death which characterized the Middle Ages. Reform or restructuring would not do. Rebirth does not equal getting back to normal. We have our own history of cultural darkness and religious failure when we think about the oppressive system of white supremacy, brutal policing practices, unprecedented rates of incarceration, along with the retrenching of the white nationalist religion of the enslavers. If our forced period of reflection caused by the restrictions and the isolation of the pandemic has taught us something, it will bring us to a place of recognizing our desperate need for a new birth of the Spirit, a resurrection, a rebirth, a renaissance. This can only happen if we take a look at the hard places we've been and the space that we're still in. Yes, we're overjoyed at the prospect of meeting in person in a few weeks' time. It will be a new place. To be sure, we will see familiar surroundings and beloved people whom we haven't seen in person for over a year. And some whom we've come to know by Zoom, we'll finally have a chance to meet in person. How we long for this time. Holding this joy and anticipation in balance with the ongoing work of recognizing the death of the old reality. Giving our creativity, effort, and prayers to forming a Renaissance space, a place of and for rebirth, while still looking intently at the longer-term effects of the pandemic is now our calling. We are called to the joyful places of the Spirit and rebirth, as well as to the hard places of the Spirit. What are our dry bones which need sinews and flesh and skin and breath, to use the language of the text? What needs new life? This week's National Geographic ran an article by Sharon Geinup entitled, "Why Getting Back to Normal May Actually Feel Terrifying." She quotes numerous healthcare and mental health professionals to explain her thesis. I will quote a few of these. "The pandemic has produced a petri dish of psychological factors that may lead to emotional health problems, anxiety, brain fog, depression, and PTSD," says Luana Marquis, a psychologist and professor at Harvard Medical School. "Symptoms of fatigue, exhaustion, and burnout are common, and stress can have long-lasting effects on brain physiology and function." Further in the same article, "There has been an extraordinary rise in anxiety and depression," says Boston College developmental psychologist Rebecca Levine Coley. "The level of these disorders is unprecedented." Barbara Sahakian, a professor of clinical neuropsychology of the University of Cambridge, noted that the mental health impacts have hit some groups harder than others. Young adults, women, parents of young children, the less educated frontline medical workers, Black and Hispanic communities, as well as those who had pre-existing mental health issues are suffering more, end quote. The article goes on to also note stunted social development in the very young, long-term medical effects for many who have survived COVID-19, the ongoing high levels of cortisol and its impacts on the brain. If any of you would like a copy of this article, please let me know. I share these professional perspectives and statistics not to add to the weight of what we have already felt over these past months, but to acknowledge this reality, which in turn can be our setup for a renaissance. What might the past year of death, hopelessness, and desolation set us up for? If we think of the metaphor of the valley filled with bones, the image of complete destruction, the same metaphor that ends with the bones being reassembled along with all the necessities of life gives us hope. Oh, the places we might go. We don't have to be content with getting back to normal. Indeed, this isn't even possible. What is possible is much better. This life-giving spirit of Pentecost, who seemed to come out of nowhere on the day of Pentecost, upended all that was known to the followers of Jesus at that time and provided hope that new and expansive open spaces are possible. They may be unimaginable from where we stand right now, but they are not impossible if we dare to dream. We are already moving toward that dream, becoming more aware of who we are personally and as a congregation, understanding what kinds of challenges inhabit our own souls, our congregation, and our community is an important step. From there, we can begin to ask the Spirit of Pentecost to give us Renaissance vision, to see through a wide-angle lens. We can ask this Spirit of Pentecost to give us keen hearing, to grasp and create new words, to give us a heightened awareness that can process new concepts and catch the nuances of wind as it rattles and blows over the dead places in our souls, our relationships, our brains, our bodies. It can help us grow with hope and courage and ask ourselves what our calling is in this newly birthed space we are coming into. Oh, the places we might go. Just because it seems impossible doesn't mean it is impossible. Remember that dry bones can live. Something had to die for a renaissance. Parched desert can and will bloom. This is the promise of the Spirit of Pentecost. Amen.